So the fourth and final structure that we want to look at are the monopolies. So we've, again, in the last section we talked about perfect competition and monopolistic competition. And so you can see that we're kind of proceeding, we were proceeding to places where there was less competition. So monopolistic competition, a little bit less competitive than perfect. Oligopolies, we said there are 5 to 8 firms, so that's even less competitive than monopolistic competition. And now we have the most extreme example, the situation where there is a monopolist. And in the case of the monopolist, quite simply, what we have is a single firm that has significant entry-exit restrictions. I mean, that's essentially, in a situation where there's no close substitute goods. So the good has to be, desired in some cases. If I was the sole producer of Asbestios, a cereal with asbestos, no one would really care because no one's going to want to buy it anyway. But as long as the good has no close substitutes, significant barriers to entry and exit, one firm. This firm is the least competitive of them all. And these entry-exit restrictions or barriers can take several forms. They could be legal. They could be like patents or trademarks. They could be, again, going back to the cost issue, could be significant costs to producing the good, or finally, they could be exclusive ownership over a essential resource. So, one type of monopoly that we actually frequently encounter is the natural monopoly. The natural monopoly is by no means natural, but it exists primarily because of the cost structure. So, shortly after I was born, there used to be only one telephone company across the entire United States. And it was called, it was called Bell Telephone Company. That was the only telephone company you could deal with. They had a monopoly over the telephone industry. And the reason why they had that was because of the significant costs to setting up the telephone infrastructure. Or we see the equivalent in certainly in Wisconsin with the energy industry, right? With electricity, for instance, right? I live in Eau Claire. I have to deal with Xcel Energy, responsible by nature, which I guess is also known as Northern States Power Company. I don't have a choice. I don't have a choice of who to purchase my electricity from. There's been some attempts to deregulate the industry. That was like the Enron example. And where I came from, I came from Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, we actually could choose who produced our electricity, but we couldn't choose who delivered it. And this natural monopoly exists because of the cost structure, right? In the electricity industry, you have to build a power plant, you have to get a billing company, you have to set up the power lines, you have to, have a campaign to, tell people don't touch wires. The way that this looks is a situation where, let's say they acted as a monopolist would. That would mean they would set their marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost. So they would produce Q amount of electricity. And they would charge this really high price. Okay, that wouldn't be very good, right? Because now we can't use a refrigerator. We have to store our stuff, with ice cubes. I would be giving this lecture by candlelight. Not a good solution. So we obviously don't want the electricity company to just be able to charge whatever price it wants. Now, what if we forced it to be like a perfectly competitive firm? Well, if that was the case, then the demand curve would not only equal price, but then in that case it would also equal marginal revenue. Okay, so if that was the case, then they would charge this price and produce this quantity, right? They would set MR equal to MC, and that would also be the price. But this is a problem because look at where the cost curve is. Average total costs are up here. So this firm would actually be earning a loss. So now the power company is going to go out of business. So what ends up actually happening is that the industry is regulated. And they're made, actually, technically speaking, they're actually made so that they charge something a little bit higher than their costs. Here in Wisconsin, we have something known as the Public Service Commission. Every time the Northern States Power Company or Wisconsin Electric wants to increase their price, they have to go to a state regulatory agency, the Public Service Commission, and request permission to get a higher price. Now, they're guaranteed to earn a profit, usually around 6 to 7%. So it's not a bad business to be in, right? If you know, not one for generally giving stock tips, but very few power companies go out of business just producing electricity and selling it. But with that said, the firm faces, unfortunately, in that kind of situation, no incentive to cut costs as cheap as they can, right? Because they always know they're going to make all their costs plus 6 to 7%. So that's really actually what ends up being the role for the Public Service Commission. There was actually a pretty noteworthy case actually a few years ago in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, when Wisconsin Electric was I think they were refurbishing their headquarters, and they had this gold-plated ceiling or something like that. Obviously, the Public Service Commission was like, "Well, geez, why are you putting in gold-plated ceilings? When the ratepayers have to pay that." And they could do the same thing, right? If they had I saw in the news recently that Wisconsin Electric again. I'm not trying to pick on the company, but they one of their power plants was by Lake Michigan, and part of the sand bluff went into the water. As long as they don't find that the power company did anything wrong, we, the ratepayers, would have to pay that. But if they find that Wisconsin Electric did something that was irresponsible, then the shareholders would have to pay that instead. So that's the natural monopoly, a type of monopoly that's closely regulated and is beneficial in existing because of the fact that it has significant costs. Other examples would include the mail, right? The U.S. postal business. For first class mail, they have a monopoly. Others can deliver packages like UPS and FedEx, but they're the only ones allowed to deliver first class mail. Amtrak, right? That's the basically government owned railroad, passenger railroad. Only one can exist because, again, significant costs to providing it. The water company, right? There's generally in a community only one water company. And then finally, although less so than used to be the case, there's generally only one waste disposal company or trash company. Now, for other types of firms here, the single price monopolist, meaning that they charge just one price and one price alone to all customers. This single price monopolist, which is our focus in this chapter, is going to have a marginal revenue curve that's twice as steep as the demand curve. They'll set their marginal revenue equal to their marginal cost, go up to the demand curve to find their price, and what you'll see is that there is a significant deadweight loss. That the consumer surplus is now a much smaller region, and that the producer surplus is much larger compared to a perfectly competitive firm. So now monopolies and perfectly competitive firms are on opposite ends of the spectrums. Under perfect competition, no deadweight loss. Under monopolists, single price monopolists, there is. Under perfect competition, there are pretty much equal points of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Under monopolistic, single price monopolist structures, there's significant producer surplus and more limited consumer surplus. Prices are higher, quantities are lower for monopolies as compared to perfectly competitive firms. What that means is that the government has taken a pretty strong stance in being opposed to monopolies because they generally do not work to the benefit of consumers. This would be, for those of you who are history buffs, this would be basically the early 20th century, early 1900s, when Theodore Roosevelt made himself a name as destroying trusts. There was one company that made sugar. There was I think even just a few companies that made steel. So with that being the case, you would want to break up those industries. You'd want to break up those trusts, those monopolies, in order to benefit the consumer. Okay, this is actually a rather short chapter. Making sure that I covered everything that was significant for this chapter. I have. Okay, so with that said, then in the next part I'm going to talk about pricing strategies that firms follow.